to make sure that all workers in this country are kept whole, they continue to get their paycheck, to make certain that in addition to that, people get a check of $2,000 a month.
Bernie Sanders joined MSNBC with Chris Hayes to discuss Trump's corporate-first approach to the crisis, as well as discussing what he thinks should be done. So I have 3 different clips here to show you. The first one, Bernie discusses the approach that is needed to take care of workers.
You cannot simply give $50 billion to the airline industry. And of course, this crisis is not their making, but you can't just give them that money to do anything they want. If we're going to bail out the airline industry, if you're going to bail out tourism, if you're going to bail out hotels, etc., what you have to do is make sure that that money is going to protect working people. And what you're seeing in the United Kingdom, in other countries, is they are saying to employers, if you retain your workers, even if you furlough them, even if they're working from home, they're going to continue to get the paycheck that the government is providing. So bottom line is, yes, I do understand that major industries, through no fault of their own, are in trouble. But our job is not to make these industries richer, not to allow them to do stock buybacks, but to protect the workers in those companies.
So one thing Bernie Sanders always does that other politicians fail to do is offer Americans context. Tell people what is going on outside of their own borders. So to go off of what Bernie was saying there about what other countries are doing in terms of taking care of their workers, let me show you this article from The Guardian. So this is about what the UK is doing, or what they at least plan to do. In an unprecedented step for the British government, the Chancellor said the state would pay grants covering up to 80% of the salary of workers if companies kept them on their payroll, rather than lay them off as the economy crashes. The extraordinary payments will be worth up to a maximum of £2,500 per month, just above the median income. So this is one example of what is going on. Let me also show you this from the New York Times. Denmark has promised to cover 75% to 90% of salaries for businesses that don't lay off their employees. And in the Netherlands, the government will pay up to 90% of wages for companies hit hard by the pandemic, with additional help for restaurants. So again, this is the context that you don't often hear about from American media or from other politicians. And Bernie Sanders offers that here. And this is nowhere near or anything like what Trump is offering right now in his plan. Let me show you the next clip, though. So this is now Bernie responding to Trump's proposed relief bill that also has a piece in there where they wouldn't have to disclose where $500 billion goes to for at least 6 months. Watch.
I wanted to get your reaction to one provision that seems a sticking point in the latest negotiations is about disclosure. This is really striking. As the legislation is currently written, I'm quoting the New York Times here, Mr. Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, would not have to disclose the recipients of these, grants, loans given out by Treasury until 6 months after the loans were dispersed. What do you think of that?
Well, I know you know what I think about that. I think that is totally insane and unacceptable. Can you imagine giving the Trump administration $500 billion, and by the way, in the midst of an election, to do anything they want with that money, to give the money to any company they want, any state they want, with no transparency at all? That is absolutely wrong.
So once again, Bernie Sanders points out exactly what the problem is with this approach. But it's also kind of obvious. I mean, if you're going to be giving or you have $500 billion that you can just give out to whoever and you don't have to disclose that for 6 months, why else would the White House be doing that unless they're trying to hide where that money is going? And by the way, this would be in a bill that doesn't include paid leave and doesn't ensure that people will keep their jobs. So the bailed out companies could still go ahead and just fire everybody and then keep the money. So again, this is the corporate first approach that Donald Trump is taking. Now, since this interview, there is potentially maybe some movement on this. So let me show you this tweet from Yamiche Alcindor. A White House official confirms that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has agreed to significant oversight over a $500 billion exchange stabilization fund. This was a big sticking point for Democrats who called it a slush fund and wanted much more oversight on how the money was spent. But even though they may be saying this, there is still nothing actually down in writing. As AOC responded here, the developments of this Senate relief bill are concerning. We are hearing lots of vague statements, but not a single member of Congress has seen actual bill text. It seems to give $500 billion away to big corporations with few worker protections. $500 billion. So this is still the money that would be given away to corporations without any actual oversight. So while the White House may be changing their tune publicly, there doesn't appear to be any actual changes yet to the plan. One last clip here. This is now Bernie discussing his vision for what needs to be done.
Look, Chris, the truth is right now, we face at this moment, in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the economic meltdown, the most serious set of crises that have been faced in this country perhaps for 100 years. And our job right now is to think big, is to act in an unprecedented way, both in terms of healthcare and in terms of the economy. And it is going to cost a lot of money, but not spending that money now will make a bad situation even worse. Because as you know, there are some people out there talking about by the end of June, unemployment being 20, 25, 30%. So right now, our focus has got to be, in my view, to make sure that all workers in this country are kept whole, they continue to get their paycheck, to make certain that in addition to that, people get a check of $2,000 a month, to make certain right now that we move in an unbelievably aggressive way to make sure that our healthcare providers, our doctors and our nurses are not dying on the job trying to protect us. And that means that Trump has got to enforce in a vigorous way the Defense Production Act to make sure that companies now are not producing T-shirts and underwear. That is not our major need at the moment. Masks, gowns, gloves are the need. And companies have got to do that. Some are already voluntarily doing it. They need to be compensated well. But they got to transform their production capabilities to deal with the crises that we face right now. The other thing I think, Chris, is that while Congress, and there are going to be people up all night right now working on this $2 trillion bill, people are working really hard. They understand the extent of the tragedy. We also have to take a deep breath and ask how we got to be in a country where so many people are in financial despair right now. What I worry about is that at a time when half of our people live in paycheck to paycheck, those paychecks are stopping. There are people out there watching this program who are saying, I can't feed my kids tomorrow. How did we get there? How do we have a healthcare system which was so unprepared, among many other things, for this epidemic?
All right, so Bernie hits on a lot of points here, but this is something where, look, last week I discussed, I had a video discussing how Trump is taking some of Bernie's ideas, at least in terms of rhetoric. Well, of course, when the pen actually hits the paper, none of those ideas are actually there. So, for example, the $2,000 a month. The Trump administration pretended to maybe be interested in giving people up to $2,000. And their plan was never a month, but it was a one-time payment, maybe up to $2,000. None of this is happening. Bernie Sanders is calling for a $2,000 a month UBI during this crisis, and that's on top of the money that people should already be getting from their employer in terms of wages being covered under a plan that should cover it, as well as the Defense Production Act. Donald Trump pretended to care about the Defense Production Act. Okay, we're going to put all these private companies to work, creating masks, creating gowns, these things needed for healthcare professionals. Of course, there's no Defense Production Act. He's not doing it. Total lie. Like, this is... Let me show you actually a tweet that Trump put out today, which really shows you how completely... stupid, I guess, is too nice of a word, really. But he tweets out this morning, the Defense Production Act is in full force, but haven't had to use it because no one has said no. Millions of masks coming back, coming as back up to states. Coming as back up to states. This is not happening. There is no Defense Production Act. He's saying, oh, it's in full force, but I haven't had to use it. It's not, it can't be in full force if you haven't had to use it. That doesn't make any sense. So the reality is, yes, there are some companies that are stepping to the plate and doing what is needed to help, but there needs to be more that is done. But the reality is what's happening is these big business interests are in Trump's ear, and they're telling him that they don't want to be forced to have to help. So instead, they're relying on people, on some companies willingly helping, but it's not enough, which is why the Defense Production Act is needed here. So, and this is all happening while Trump, I don't have it in front of me, but while Trump, his approval rating in polls based on his response to the coronavirus is pretty solid. Like, I think last night, it's over 50%. So more than half of Americans think Trump is doing a good job here in his response when he hasn't done anything. It's all just been words. But people think that because there has been no leader of the Democratic Party, either Schumer, Pelosi, or presumptive nominee Joe Biden, that is holding Trump's feet to the fire. If Sanders was the nominee, there would be a focus on what he is saying and what he is doing. But there is no focus. So all Sanders can hope for is the occasional appearance on Chris Hayes. We hope people see it and understand that Trump is not doing what is needed. But not enough people are hearing or seeing this message. So people think that Trump is doing something like the Defense Production Act or maybe like a universal basic income when he's not doing it, because there is no actual response to Trump. So there are very few leaders right now in the U.S. Bernie Sanders is clearly one of them, and really potentially, I mean, at least in terms of candidates for president, the only one. But you also have AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, some other leaders out there that are actually fighting for people, fighting to ensure workers keep their wages, ensure workers are getting a $2,000 a month check, ensure workers are getting, whether it's paid time off or whatever it is. Very few leaders actually fighting for this, but there are some Democrats that are doing it. But again, they don't get the exposure, so people think Trump is doing a great job when he's not doing anything.